Hello, welcome back. I'm Andreas, your tech-curious web designer. In this video, we will explore how a multi-tenant SaaS application could be structured. So SaaS stands for Software as a Service, and it typically offers a dashboard where users can create their own instance of a service with their own database or database schema attached to it. I will demonstrate how we can create tenants directly from the website, as well as how to add users with different roles or permissions to the site. But before we get started, a quick shout out to my new supporters on Patreon. A high five to Herr Wolf and a fist bump to Phil and Kletzter. Thank you so much for your support. I really appreciate it. Okay, and now without further ado, let's dive in. First, I will demonstrate the basic SaaS application we're going to build in this video. Here we have a dashboard where I can see the tenants I have created or I am a member of. This could be any type of projects or services, or in the case of this demo, we have a list of companies. Let's create a new tenant. I add here the name of the new tenant and the subdomain, which will have the same name as the database schema. Then create. And now my new tenant is created, and I'm also automatically logged in, as the user table is shared with every tenant. So one user can be a member of many tenants. And as we can see, I'm the admin of this tenant, and additionally I can select a role, which could be linked to role-specific permissions on the site. And my role at Apple will be programmer. And now I'm showing up in the list on the right. Okay, now let's add a new member. I'm logged in as Pete, but I have not yet joined Apple. So before I can do that, I have to select a role. So Pete will be the designer, and I'm also adding Bobby as the manager. Okay, this is basically the application we're going to build in this video. I will start from scratch. However, I'm going to assume that you're familiar with the knowledge we gathered in the previous tutorials of this series, as I will go through the setup rather quickly. Okay, with that said, let's get started. I have a new empty folder here in Visual Studio Code, and as first I will install my Django-Starter code, which you can grab from my GitHub repository at github.com/ndjut/django-starter. Here you can find instruction how to install this boilerplate code. I'm grabbing this command here, open the terminal in Visual Studio Code, and paste the command. Next we create the virtual environment and activate it. Then we upgrade pip and install the project's requirements. For tenants, we need a Postgres database, and I'm running this database inside a Docker container. For this, I create now a Docker Compose file. And spin up the container. Okay, the Postgres database is now up and running. Let's connect it now with Django. For this, I need to install the Postgres driver. We also need the Django-Tenants package for the tenants engine. And then I go to the settings.py file in the core folder and add the database configuration, which is using the tenants PostgreSQL backend. Alright, next we can add the tables to the database and create a super user. And then start up the server. And we can see the app running on localhost :8000. Okay, now let's add the tenant setup. I'm creating a tenants manager app for the tenants tables. Then in the models.py file, I add the tenant and domain model. Here important we have the auto-create schema and the auto-drop schema property attached to it. So with those two properties, we can create and delete schemas directly from the tenants model. And then I create a custom admin interface just for the tenant manager. Alright, next we add the tenants configurations in the settings.py file. We change the installed apps to shared apps. Then we add the Django Tenants app and the tenant manager. Then in the tenants apps, we add our main application, which can have tenant-specific data, but the users app I leave in the shared app to have global access to it. And then I combine shared apps and tenants apps to the installed apps list. Next, I create a separate public URLs file. I make a copy of the urls.py file and call it urls_public. Then in the public file, I include all the URLs from the URLs file and add the tenant manager admin interface path. And import the tenant admin site variable. And then we define the public schema URL configuration in the settings. Next we add the tenant model, the tenant domain model, and set the show public if no tenant found variable to true. Finally, we add the tenant middleware as very first item in the list and add the tenants database router. Alright, save this file and we are ready now to run make migrations and migrate. And then spin up the server again. And to show the name of the tenant on a tenant side, I add some code to my header.html file. Here, instead of project title, I display the tenant name if we are on a tenant side. Otherwise, I display the title SaaS multi-tenancy. Okay, let's check the site now. I refresh the page. The title has changed and our site is now set up to handle multi-tenants. Now let's add the functionality to create a tenant directly from this page. For this I prepared a basic dashboard interface and you can grab this code from my GitHub repository at github.com/ndchat/tenants. Here I go to the SaaS folder and grab the home.html file. I copy the code, then I'm going to my home.html file and paste the code in here. Refresh the page. To access the dashboard, we need to log in. Then I see here a drop down with my tenants. At the moment the list is still empty. And on the right, I will add the logic now to add a new tenant. Let's also quickly edit the profile to display an avatar and a name for this account. Okay, as first let's add the create tenant form. The code for this form we can grab again from GitHub, forms.py, and then in my home folder I create a forms.py file and paste the code in there. So here we have the form, which is connected to the tenant model class. We use the name and schema name fields and display them as text input fields. Underneath I also have a clean method for the schema name, as the schema name has to follow certain rules. For example, it has to be lowercase and can only contain numbers and hyphens. And I also check if the schema name or subdomain already exists in the database. Otherwise, it will raise an error. Then I add this form to my home view. I import this tenant form. Initialize this class. Define a context. And add the context to the return statement. Okay, save this file. Refresh the page. And the form is on the site. Now let's add the logic to save the form data in the database. So if it's a post request, I get the form with the data, and if the data is valid, I save it in the database. With this, we have created a tenant object, and Django automatically creates now also a schema. However, this schema is empty, and we need to migrate the tables. But instead of manually doing this, we can call the migration command directly here in the code. With this call command, we run migrate_schemas and define the schema name. Okay, let's import the call command. From django.core.management import call command, and I will also import some other bits we need in a second. We need the redirect function, we need settings, and I also import the models from my Tenant Manager app. So once we have migrated the tables, we create the domain object. Here we have the tenant property, which is linked to the tenant we just created, the domain, which defines the subdomain, that is set up with a schema name, and the base domain, which I will define as a base URL variable in the settings.py file. And I also set isPrimary to true. Now let's add this base URL to our settings.py file. So in development, my domain will be localhost, and I also add here the port. We will need it later to construct the whole tenant URL. In production, this base URL will be our custom domain, and we don't need the port, so I use here just an empty string. Okay, save this file, and let's go back. So once we have the domain, we would like to be redirected to this tenant site. So here I construct the redirect link with the domain we just defined and add the port variable. Alright, save this file. And let's check it out. Let's refresh the page. I add a tenant. And there is our tenant. We can see we are now on the Apple subdomain, and also the title of this page changed to the tenant name. Awesome! But as we can notice, we are not logged into this tenant. This has to do with cookies. Browsers treat localhost differently than actual domain names. Cookies, especially session cookies, are domain specific, and localhost is not a real domain. So in production, this works as expected. But in our local development environment, where we use localhost, we need to log in manually to each tenant. If somebody of you knows a solution how to deal with this problem in a simple way, please share it in the description below. Let's see how we can log in the user to the tenant side after the tenant is created. So with the schema context function, we can switch to a different schema. We have to provide the backend we are using. I'm using the all-auth backend in this project. And then I call the login function to log in with the current user. Let's import those functions. So from Django-Tenants.utils import schema_context, and from Django.contrib.auth import login. Okay, save this file. And in the settings.py file, I add some session configurations. I comment them out because they can cause some issues when using the localhost. In production, we define the session engine, session cookie domain, and session cookie path. Alright, let's log in. I'm logged in, however, I don't want to see the dashboard page here again. Let's display a tenant homepage instead. And the code for this you can grab again from the repository. We select here the home_tenant.html file, copy the code, then I duplicate the home.html file, call it home_tenant.html, and swap it with the new code. Okay, save this file. Then we go to the home view and add a condition. So if the request object does not have the tenant attribute, we display the home.html file. Otherwise, we use the home_tenant file. And finally, we add the template name variable to the return statement. Okay, save this file, and let's check it out. I refresh the page. And now we display the tenant homepage. But for now, we have no relationship yet between the tenant and the user. For this, I'm creating now an additional table in the database to store which user is member of which tenant. So I'm going to my tenant manager, here to models.py. I'm creating here a tenant member class. We have here first the tenant property as foreign key with the related name of members. Then we have the user property connected to the user. Let's import this user class. And then I also add the property isAdmin to check if the user is the admin of this tenant. Then I add the meta class to make sure the user and the tenant are unique together. And also string representation for the admin interface, displaying the information for the tenant, user, and the admin. Okay, save this file. Then I'm going to my admin.py file and register tenant member. Okay. And then we run make migrations and migrate. Then we go back to the home view. So after I create the domain, I also create a tenant member object. The user is the logged in user, tenant is the tenant which was created, and we set isAdmin to true. Okay, save this file. And then I define a tenant member variable, which gives me the object for this user and tenant. This, however, would give me a server error if this object doesn't exist, so I put it in a try except block. If the object doesn't exist, tenant member is none. And for good measure, I add a comment for this code block. Okay, and then I add this variable to the context. Save this file. And let's test this. So let's add a new tenant. I'm going back to my dashboard. I add Microsoft as my new tenant. The tenant is created. Let's log in. And now we can see my tenant object exists and I'm recognized as the admin. Okay, let's try to access the site with a different user. So I'm logging out. And create a new account. Okay, we signed in with Pete now, but Pete is not yet member of Microsoft. So to access the site, he needs to contact the admin. Okay, let's add him now as a member. I am here now on the admin tenants interface and I create now a new tenant member. Tenant is Microsoft and user is Pete. I refresh the page and Pete is now signed up to this tenant. Okay, let's display now the tenants a user belongs to in the dashboard. For this I added myself also as a member of the Apple tenant I created before. And I should see Apple and Microsoft as my two tenants in the tenants list here. Okay, let's add this logic. So in my view, I want to get a list of the tenants of the logged in user. And I can do this by filtering the tenant member table by the logged in user. Then to avoid a server error, I check if the user is authenticated. Else, I return an empty list. And each of the tenants in the list will link out to the tenant side. Therefore, I set here also a base domain variable, which differs between localhost and the live domain in production. And then I'm adding those two variables to the context. Okay, save this file, refresh the page. And as we can see, we have now the two tenants showing up here. And when I click on Apple, I go to the Apple site. Nice.
Nice.
Okay, let's sign up with a new user. I'm signed in now with Lucy, but instead of contacting the admin to gain access to the site, I want to add here the option to choose a role. On a live site, this could still require verification by an admin. However, for this demo, I just add the user as a member when they select a role. For this I prepared a new template, so let's go to the repository. Here I'm selecting the home tenant roles.html file, copy the code, and replace the home_tenant.html code. Save this file and refresh the page. And on this page we can select a role now. We have not defined any roles yet. Let's add them to the Tenant-Member model class. And here I'm defining some role choices. For example, manager, designer, and programmer. These are written as tuples in Django. The first is the value stored in the database, while the second is displayed in the template. And then I'm adding the role property with the choices attribute. Okay, save this file. Let's make the migrations. Run migrate. And start up the server again. And finally, we add the member roles variable to the context. Okay, save this file. Refresh the page. And as we can see, we have the three choices now displayed here. Now let's add the logic to add the selected role to the database and add the user as a member of the site. For this, I'm creating a new function. So just underneath the home function here, I add the tenant member role function, which takes in the tenant ID. Then first we check if it's actually a post request. Then we get the role value from the post data and fetch the tenant object from the database. Then I'm using here the get or create function to get this tenant member object if it exists, or otherwise create it. Then we add the role to this member. And finally, we save this object in the database. And when this is done, we redirect the user back to the tenant page. Okay, save this file. Next, we add the path for this function to the url.py file. I name this path member-role, and the path includes the tenant ID. Okay, save this file. And as last, we add this link to the template. So I'm going to my home_tenant.html file. Here is my form, and inside the action here, I add the member role path and pass through the tenant ID. Okay, save this file, and let's check it out. I select a role and submit. And as we can see, Lucy is logged in and her role is designer. Let's add some more members to this Apple team to work on the next groundbreaking product. Alright, that's it. We built now a very basic SaaS application. Thank you so much for watching and supporting me with this channel. I hope to see you very soon. Until then, stay curious, my friends, and bye bye for now.